Welcome to Creative Soul Life and episode 10, a review of Gift from the Sea. The last several episodes I've talked a lot about creativity, and this whole show is about creativity and self-care. So the next several episodes I'm really going to focus on the self-care portion of creativity. And this review of Gift from the Sea is a perfect way to start off with this. So this was written by Morrow Lindbergh. When she wrote this, she had a husband and 5 children. The book is essentially set on a retreat she takes into an island here in Florida, Captiva Island, by herself without her husband and her kids. So I'm just kind of setting the stage so you see her mindset that she goes into while writing this. So in the first chapter, she talks about arriving at the beach, putting aside the project she had brought to work on, and just kind of being present and being receptive to what the sea is going to teach her. And during this time, she either collects or is given shells, and each shell gives her some sort of lesson and reflection on life. So the first shell is the channeled whelk, and she likens this to simplicity. Talks about how her life is full of distractions and difficulties, and then she says she wants to learn how to remain whole in the midst of the distractions of life. And her first step was simplification of life. And there at the beach house, she kind of talks out, it's forcing her to simplify her clothes, her surroundings. She's not worried about the cobwebs in the corner and that type of thing. But then she goes on to try and figure out how to pull some of this simplicity back into her normal life. She ruminates on how most Americans choose complexity over simplicity. And that finding simplicity is trying to find, is swinging between solitude and communion. That you can't remove yourself all the time and go away at a beach retreat. You've got to find this simplicity in your own life and your own surroundings. The next shell, the moon shell, is one way to do this through solitude. Solitude for her is a retreat, much like the one she's on. She points out with all of our modern technologies and such, there's a lot of opportunity to be alone, but we're so frightened of it that we rarely let it happen, that we always have noise going on, music, TV, or on social media. We rarely let ourselves be alone with ourselves in quiet and solitude. And she's saying this is very key, it's very vital, it's very important to be alone. And I personally think this chapter is one of the most significant chapters of the book. I think this is a key lesson, this lesson of solitude. She says, only when one is connected to one's own core is one connected to others, and constantly emphasizes the need for the solitude to not just for your own health, sanity, and everything, but it is truly the only way to have a better connection with others in your life. And like a lot of women, has work, but she also has the brunt of the responsibility of the household as well and her children. And so she talks quite a bit about that, the duties of the home, that's part of the busyness that's going on. And she talks about how that kind of takes pieces from us, because when you're in this role, you're naturally a giver. You're kind of a nurturer. It's your nature to give. You feel inclined to give. You want to give, and you give, but you give in so many different ways. And she talks about how we give in different pieces of ourselves here and there, to our children, to our husband, to the duties at home, to volunteering, to work, all these different places we're giving. And she says, what a woman resents is not so much giving herself in pieces as giving herself purposelessly. So especially women who have had more of a caretaking role. I know this is something I've struggled with. I have worked mostly part-time, occasionally full-time, but mostly part-time throughout my adult life. But my main role was the caretaker, the homemaker, the children, keeping the house steady while my husband, who was a breadwinner, had the bulk of the working hours. And you don't have those results. You don't have those concrete results of when you take care of you wash the dishes, and you can barely turn around and there's another dirty dish laying there. You don't see the results of your giving. You give yourself into a meal and it's consumed within 10, 15, 20 minutes, and then there's just the mess left that you've got to clean up. A lot of our giving doesn't have some sort of concrete result from it that's measurable. Whereas when you have a career, a full-time job that is a career, you can see those results more concretely. You've got work projects, raises, you're moving forward, promotions, etc. These things tend to build on each other more than that kind of homemaking, caretaking role. And so how do you replenish? How do you replenish from all the giving to not feel empty? And Anne says the answer is solitude. We make time for appointments, we make time for shopping, we make time for our children, our spouses, but we rarely make time to be alone with ourselves. In fact, she says to be alone is even considered rude. And I'll quote, "What a commentary on our civilization, when being alone is considered suspect, when one has to apologize for it, make excuses, hide the fact that if one practices it, like a secret vice." I know for myself, I have always known the importance of my alone time. And I mean alone. I do not want anyone around me. I love my children and my husband very much, but I have to have time alone. I think I've been this way my whole life. And it took years for my husband to realize that this was not any sort of reflection on him whatsoever. It was not, I didn't have a problem with him. There was nothing against him or wrong with him. It was me. I wanted to be alone. I needed that time to myself to kind of restore my energy, my sense of well-being. And so Anna's right. For someone to be alone is an oddity. It's, you're a loner, is there something wrong? And it's not that I want to be alone all the time. Absolutely not. I love being around my family, friends, and different social things. But I cherish that time alone. And I think it's needed. And I don't apologize for it. If anything, I kind of had to train my husband that I needed it. And you kind of have to do that. But it's worth it. My alone time looks different depending on the season. And Anne discusses it goes beyond just being alone. It's learning how to use it, how to feed your soul. And she uses those words, feed your soul. And I just smiled when I saw that. I've read this book several times, and maybe that's where I picked it up from. So how do you carve out time alone, and how do you use it? And talks about how some of modern society and conveniences have changed that opportunity to be alone, especially in terms of like homemaking. She says, nothing feeds the center so much as creative work, even humble kinds like cooking and sewing. Baking bread, weaving cloth, putting up preserves, teaching and singing to children must have been far more nourishing than being the family chauffeur or shopping or doing housework with mechanical aids. And there's some truth to this. When you think back several generations to those caretakers and homemakers, they had more of that opportunity for quiet time, reflective time. There is something very nourishing about that creative aspect of making something, especially in your solitude. Think of how many things were taken up during the time of the forced solitude during the COVID shutdowns. Sourdough bread baking became big, needlepoint. I had classes on Skillshare and they spiked. Everybody was wanting to do and learn something about being alone and being away from others. That forced solitude had us turning towards those creative things to fill these voids, to the point that I think a lot of people realize that that was a void that was there even when you have access to people. There was something missing in the soul of not having these quiet, contemplative, creative works. So even though Anne was describing the contrast between a homemaker from several generations or even one or two generations ago to the present, she does say the answer is not going back, but It can be physical or intellectual or artistic, any creative life proceeding from oneself. So just to be conscious in your pursuits, to be conscious in your solitude that you are doing something nourishing and creative. Her next shell is a gift to her. It's a double sunrise shell. She describes like the wings of a butterfly, two halves. And she uses this shell to talk about relationships. And of course, again, she's a married woman with a husband and children. And a big thing was the fleetingness of relationships, that earliness of a marriage, the falling in love, the newness, the earliness of small children, having children, those early years when there's a bond between mother and child. They said these are fleeting. These are moments that you go through and you get to the other side and there's no going back. There's no going back to a newborn baby again or the earliness of your marriage. But even though you can't return, there are stages. There's change. There's expansion. There's new forms of the relationships. And this is what you need to be careful about to ensure that they do go forth and develop. The thing she cautions is that even though she's talking about relationships, it's yourself going into the relationship. So there still needs to be a nurturing of self in order to nurture relationships. She says, woman can best refine herself by losing herself in some kind of creative activity of her own. So with this, she finds and is better able to pursue other relationships. Having that inner peace that comes from solitude, the alone time, a creative endeavor, the things that nourish your soul also help you have the ability to nourish your relationships. Then she moves to the oyster shell, or the middle years of life. And she has a very lovely description of the oyster shell as much like with its bumps and humps and shells on top of it. It's how your life grows in that middle years. You've got children who've got obligations. Your house is probably grown to accommodate this. You've got rooms here and there. There's all kinds of activity. Your own social life has its bumps and things. You've got commitments for the kids with their sports and their school and all those types of things. You may have work that's lumped in there as well. And social obligations, either just pure social through work. It's just this conglomeration that sometimes doesn't look that pretty. I mean, honestly, the outside of an oyster is not that pretty, but it's useful. It's effective. It's practical. It's what it is. And she said the oddities are the add-ons in these stage. And the shell's like that hodgepodge of middle years of accumulation, of growing. And she describes where you hit a point in those middle years that it's time to shed some of these things. You start to outgrow it. It's time to move beyond some of the ambitions. It's time to shed some of your material accumulations and possessions. And especially like ambitions that become less obtainable, but there's a certain relief to it. She says at this point, you're unlikely to start a brand new career or a brand new family. I mean, you might, but does not look like these things of your youth, of your early adulthood. And you start to realize that there are certain things that it's just time to let them go. I know I've hit this point. I have always been a runner, and I was kind of forced to stop health-wise about 10 years ago, but I kept trying. And it was really only about 3 years ago that I realized that running is too hard on my body. Mentally, I call myself a runner, but physically, it's just hard. And I can keep striving, and I'm not giving up on physical good health or anything, but I don't think I'm going to run a marathon. That has been on my bucket list forever, and I finally took that off. Maybe one day I'll walk a marathon. That'd be great. But ambitions like this, you just hit a point that you realize it's probably not going to happen. And honestly, it's okay. It's kind of freeing, especially a lot of the physical expectations of having that picture perfect 20-year-old, 20s body, the washboard abs. In fact, a lot of these expectations and ambitions and possessions, things like that, are shed, it gives you some space and personal freedom for her next lesson. The Argonauta, or paper nautilus. The first 3 shells are common, and they're kind of correlate to the common areas of our life. But the Argonauta is a beautiful and rare shell, and it represents you moving into your personal and independent growth. And it's something that is rare. It is something that is unusual to take that time and focus like that. She says, woman must come of age by herself. She must learn not to depend on another, nor to feel she must prove her strength by competing with another. I took this to mean her inference in the book seems heavily to talk about relationship or marriage. But I personally think that this is true with all relationships. There is a unique type of growth when you stop comparing yourself with others, when you stop competing with others, when you realize that the best way to measure is to measure yourself, measure your own growth, measure where you are in your journey, regardless of where everyone else is in their journey. And I talk about this a lot because with social media, it's so hard not to compare, not to compete, not to use other people as a standard of measurement for everything, for beauty, for physicalness, for success, whatever your version of success is. There's so many examples in our face that it's very difficult to wade through that and to realize that that's not the healthiest measure. You are your healthiest measure. And the only way to get there is to realize that you don't need that competition and comparison, that this journey is personal. This journey is you and you alone. And by embarking on this journey and this personal growth and this finding of yourself, this feeding of your soul, it actually enables you to move in a better rhythm with others, with your partner, with your children, with society in general. The more confidence you have in yourself and your dance steps, the more you are able to move in rhythm with others. Anne talks about what stunts this personal growth is fear. And the only way this fear is exercised is by its opposite, which is love. And not love, romantic love, but a love for yourself, a belief in yourself, a self-love, not just relational love, but love in here and a love for what you're doing and what you're doing for yourself. Part of this journey and this self-love and this personal development is learning how to live in the present and accepting now. Living with the ebbs and tides of life, taking things as they come and as they go. And each cycle is valid. Each cycle has its reason. But you learn to flow with it. You find that rhythm, not just relationships, but with life itself. So as she's preparing to depart, her next chapter is a few shells, or empty space. Anne talks about how beauty needs space. That one tree on a hill is much more beautiful than one mixed in the forest where you can't see it. One picture on a wall with space around it is much more appreciated than a wall full. Then in order to appreciate beauty, you need space, and you need space in your life to see this beauty. Her real world, she said, is full of so many opportunities, so many interesting people. It's hard to find that space. It's necessary, and it's necessary for her key takeaways from this, which was simplicity, balance, space, and the necessity of a creative life. So in the final chapter, The Beach at My Back, Anne discusses how does she take this back to real life. From these things she's learned alone on a beach retreat, how does she move into her real life, which is busy and hectic and noisy and chaotic and full of distractions and interrelationships and interpersonal obligations? How do you keep these lessons in the midst of all of this? But how do you take all of this and apply it to the vastness of life? And she discusses especially our life now is overconnected. We're expected to care for the world. Everyone in the world, we have to be hyper aware of all of this connectedness and feel for everyone and solve everything. She says modern communication loads us with more problems than the human frame can carry. At any time, we can know what's going on across the world and the wars and the problems and across states, everything. We hear about this, we see all this. It's overwhelming because we're supposed to care and try and solve and help. She asks, can one solve world problems when one is unable to solve one's own? And her solution is to focus on the present, focus on your basic circle, and focus on yourself. She says, we are now ready for a true appreciation of the value of the here and now and the individual. So essentially, if you start at your center, you take care of here, you take care of your own soul, that gives you the power and the ability and the presence to take care of your relationships. And as you take care of your relationships and you're in the rhythm of life, you're able to extend that to your community and so forth. But you can't do that without taking care of here first. So I want to talk a little bit about Morrow Lindbergh and the origins of the book. As you can see, Gift from the Sea is not a big book. It's a very small read, and it's applicable even though she was a mom. She was a wife and a mom at the time she wrote this. I try and read this every few years because I think it's applicable for whatever stage your life is in, that you're in. Especially when you consider she wrote this in the early 1950s, 75 years ago. And she talked about modern conveniences and such. And back then, that would have been things like telephone and TV. I think a lot of these lessons are even more applicable now with the advent of social media, of being super connected all the time. These lessons are even more important than they were 75 years ago. Now, if her name sounds familiar, that's because she was the wife of Charles Lindbergh, who made the first interatlantic solo flight. What's interesting, though, is Anne wasn't just a housewife. She was a pilot as well, and she did several trips with them. She was also an author. She wrote more than just this book. She was very involved in her life around her, and she juggled these things. And she kept referring to the modern woman and feminism. These were, she had the same balance and juggling issues that we all face now. So it's still very timely advice. This is my grandmother's copy of the book. She loaned it to me a number of years ago, and she has her name written in it in 1971. So that was actually a year before I was born. So my grandmother, at a time when her children were grown, or mostly grown, found this book was applicable to her life. And she mentioned it to me many times over the years, again, loaned it to me. And a few years ago, she actually gave me her copy. It was printed in 1955. I'm not quite sure if this copy is that old, but again, it doesn't matter if you're in your later middle years like me, or if you're a young mom. This book is absolutely priceless in some of the lessons that it gives on self-care, the importance of creativity, and feeding your soul. And we will go even further in this concept next week with The Calm Before the Storm. So have you read Gift from the Sea? What are your thoughts? How did it apply in your life? What are the lessons you learned? What were the key takeaways for you? Now go be creative and feed your soul. If you like this episode, please hit like and subscribe and check out some of the upper episodes in Creative Soul Life. Thank you.